Okay, guys, so I figured out a way that we can upload the PowerPoints through Keynote. The only thing is that I only have 15 minutes, so we're going to do this as quick as possible so that I can upload this to YouTube and you guys can use this as a supplemental tool for your exams and for understanding the course content as a whole. When we take a look at the readings, I wanted to review the 5 impact areas of colonization because it's truly the foundation of the class and understanding the goals of decolonization. We want to take a look at historical trauma transmission. Well, in actuality, we want to take a look at 3 different components. The first is actual trauma. Trauma takes place to an individual in the same generation. So, for example, if an individual was beat for utilizing their language at a boarding school, they are undergoing trauma. That trauma is taken care to them. If that individual, when they grow up, decides that speaking the native language and teaching that to their children is putting their children in danger of receiving the same physical punishment and psychological punishment that they did for speaking the language. What we're seeing here is an example of historical trauma transmission where that trauma is now being placed onto the following generation without it impacting them physically at first in the same manner that it did with the first generation. So as a result, the second generation no longer speaks their language, and the generations after them no longer speak their native language because we can track that back to an individual's decision that they didn't want their child to speak the language because of the trauma that they suffered. So those are the things that we want to take a look at when we look at historical trauma. You want to take a look at historical trauma, which actually takes place in one specific generation, and then we take a look at historical trauma, which takes place as a result of that initial trauma in subsequent generations. Okay, and so this leads us to the concept of intergenerational, right? When we take a look at intergenerational, one of the things that often comes up is the concept of the 7th-generation philosophy. In the 7th-generation philosophy, the idea is that an individual utilizes 3 generations before them, the knowledges, the skills, the experiences that have been passed on to them in order to make well-informed, critically thought out decisions that will not only affect their own generation, but 3 generations ahead of them. And so that there's constant interweaving of knowledges and experiences that make our current realities. And so that's that 7th-generation philosophy. Now, when we take a look at colonization as a whole, right, and historical trauma response, I want you to understand that there's no single trauma response, meaning that historical trauma and historical trauma transmission manifests itself in 5 different areas, right? In the physical, in the economic, in the cultural, in the social, and in the psychological. What does that mean? Well, that we can see evidence of trauma in subsequent generations, right, in the physical areas. So why do we no longer dress in traditional manners? How did that change? Where was there historical trauma and trauma involved in that? Our hairs, a lot of people are talking about in the contemporary about hair being cut off, Native American boys having long hair. And so where is the negative pushback on those kinds of physical components? And as you can tell, they all intertwine. And so it's when you talk about the physical, it's not just the physical. It seeps into all of these different other areas. Now, why does that happen? The reason why that happens is specifically with how the reading highlighted that there are 5 impact areas of colonization. Now, this slide and this particular point that we're going to talk about in the next couple minutes is extremely important because it starts to understand how our class is formulated and also how colonization and decolonization are intertwined together. Now, when one culture takes over another culture, there's going to be all these different types of transitions that take place. And the first thing that's going to take place is a physical transition, right? There's a winner and there's a loser. And so that's the first thing that takes place, and that the loser usually loses their land and the winner lays claim to it. So there's that physical component that that we see. Right next to the physical component, we see an economic change, a transition in the way that people did commerce before. And so, if we look specifically in the Southwest region area, things cost things, but it wasn't through a monetary system that we know today as capitalism. Is very much based in kinship. So the concept of um, isn't a fluffy understanding of how we know each other to be related according to family and clans. It's very much ingrained into our original economic system, where we understand as the link to how we relate to the world around us, not just the physical world, but the supernatural world as well. Where do we fit in? How do prayers have power? How do our society place hierarchy systems on each other? Well, that all transitioned, not so much with the Spanish nor with the Mexicans, but definitely when the United States took over this area. We see both the physical and the economic changes take place. Now, once those cultural transitions take place, we start seeing a cultural dispossession. Dispossession means to take away something. And in this case, it's going to be various cultural components. In this impact area, we're looking at specifically culture and social components. So the concepts of how we practice who we are and how we're culturally different from everybody starts to change. A prohibition of cultural understandings and cultural practices start to set in, and the way that we interact with individuals and how our organization as a society changes. And so that's when we start seeing how we start morphing into the mainstream society, okay, from a cultural and social perspective. Now, once that takes place, right, after we've gone through the cultural transition, the cultural dispossession, then we start taking a look at cultural oppression. And this is the psychological component. This is where people start thinking that they are better than or less than based off of culture. So, for example, if somebody speaks Navajo only, and we start taking a look at how individuals are being forced to speak only English. An English speaker will look down on the Navajo speaker. And so those are the things that we start to learn. Why do people who eat mutton, for example, how they're judged as compared to what Westerners would consider a more refined meat, which is lamb. And so those are the kinds of psychological components that get put into our mindsets. So why is that important? Well, when we start taking a look at the goals of decolonization, we want to flip that scale. We have to start off with the physical. We have to start off with the psychological. We start off with the psychological, the cultural oppression, because that's a very individual point. Decolonization happens like a ripple effect. So if you yourself aren't understanding how colonization has impacted your world, there's no way for you to start morphing into a proper ripple effect that could affect more than just you and your individual family. So when we look at these cultural oppressions, that's the point of this class, is for us to really self-evaluate how colonization has affected our native nation, and how we as individuals either suffer or work within that realm. Sorry, that's my son. Now, where most people start going and having issues at is because they start off at the physical and they forget about the psychological components. So that's why in this class we're truly going to focus in on that cultural oppression. Now, this brings us to one of our last slides, which is the myths and possibilities of decolonization. Decolonization does not promise freedom. Freedom is very costly, and so we have to understand that decolonization happens both as a process and events. The events are that physical and economic transition, which are the most difficult to attain. But the psychological, the social, and the cultural, those we can start to work with under realms of self-determination and self-sufficiency. And so but freedom, not. Prosperity, it's not something that's supposed to make us wealthy. When we go into war, which when we look at decolonization and the physical component, it is a declaration of war. And so although there'll be pockets of wealth going on, it's not meant to bring wealth from an economic sense, rather from a cultural sense, it will. Sovereignty. In order to be sovereign, once again, we'll go through this later on in the class. We need to have our own land, which the Navajo Nation doesn't, with the exception of a few pocket areas, thanks to the doings of a former president and the checkerboard area. We need to have our own economic basis, which we don't. We function very well within the capitalist United States system, and then we also need to have a military in order to protect both the economic and the physical territories that we are working with. And it's not a return to the past. A lot of people think that we can just throw the baby out with the bathwater, right, and just get rid of the colonizers. We've been so heavily infiltrated with it. There's no way to go back. It's about how we self-determine our future and our current realities. So just keep that in mind. We know the myths and the possibilities of decolonization. And the last thing that I wanted to leave you with is that prior to European expansion and the Russian invasion to the Americas, we had social ills. This was not a very easy life that existed prior to those infiltrations. We had our own traditional monsters that existed, and those monsters happened to be the half brothers of the hero twins, and they were allowed to live and stay with us because it was a way to start to maintain order with the humans that exist in this particular world. And it helps to establish a hierarchy system. People always said that Native Americans and Navajos, that we existed with equality. There's no such thing as equality, and there wasn't there was an equality that existed prior to colonization. So I want to make sure that we're well versed in that. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to put them underneath this video, and I will get to them as soon as I can. Thank you.